Today I'm going to say a few words about Joseph Conrad's classic short story novella, I suppose, Heart of Darkness. And I will say, just to begin with, that what I do have to say today uh, draws upon an essay that I published several years ago in a literary journal in Romania, the Lucian Blaga University in Sibiu, Romania. And the title of the journal was East-West Cultural Passages, if I'm not mistaken. The title of that essay was Always Symmetrize, forming Bonds in Heart of Darkness. And I put it on the internet a couple of years ago, so if you just type in, I suppose, Cousineau, Always Symmetrize, it should turn up. And so what I'd like to do today is simply to, rather than going through the article in its entirety, simply to touch on some of the main points that have to do quite precisely with the subject of the book, which I'm working on now and which will have a chapter on Heart of Darkness called Creating Bonds in Heart of Darkness rather than Forging Bonds. The title itself then draws upon, it refers to a passage in Heart of Darkness where the narrator Marlowe says, and thus a subtle bond had been created. I think it's with his fireman. It's one of the Africans in any event that a bond between them had been created. Kind of what I'm talking about in terms of this whole subject of bilateral symmetry, or what I call the bilateral imperative of writing in the work that I'm doing, the book that I'm doing right now, has to do with the idea that you have these bonds not only between characters, between Marlowe and the fireman, between Marlowe and the chief accountant whom he meets, or Marlowe and Kurtz, and so on, the various other kinds of encounters and perhaps in some cases bonds that are formed between Marlowe and other characters, but also the idea that there are bonds that are formed among or between various episodes of the novel, quite disparate, quite scattered episodes of the novel, and also say this right now, that Conrad often, as he's writing the novel, as he's going from episode to episode, from beginning through middle to end, he's always creating these bilateral relations, not only between characters, not only between scenes, but also between words. If you do a word search on Kindle, and I'm going to point out a couple of the places where he does this, you'll see a word that's used maybe very early on in Heart of Darkness reappears, but reappears in a very different and perhaps in a very opposing context. Maybe I'll make this point also that, as I said, the title comes from a particular passage, just a little phrase within the Heart of Darkness. And what I want to suggest by that, just to elaborate on that point a little bit, is that the entirety of my project, it's called, the book will be called Balancing All the Symmetrical, I've changed it now, the Bilateral Imperative of Writing. It will be concerned in each of the examples, each of the classic literary masterpieces which I discuss in the book. I will be calling attention continuously through to the relationship, we could call it the relationship between the container and that which is contained within the container. So what's contained, sometimes a very tiny detail, maybe just a pairing of two words, what's there, the pattern of that which is contained is a bilateral, a left-right symmetry, and the novel itself, or the work, depending on, because I'm doing Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, also a poem, will be the entirety of the work. The architectural form of the work, as it were, will conform to, if you will have been created in obedience to what I call the bilateral imperative. Oh, and just really briefly, I'll mention the title of the article, and maybe I'll put it in as the title of this video also. The article was Always Symmetrize, forging bonds in Heart of Darkness. And some of you, at least maybe many of you, maybe mostly all of you, will catch the echo in the Always Symmetrize of Frederick Jameson. Frederick Jameson's Always Historicize. What is his book? The Political Unconscious. The Political Unconscious begins Always Symmetrize, and that's kind of a motto, a slogan that's carried throughout, in which the idea then of relating historical literary works to the historical substratum, and in my work, it's relating literary works to the ahistorical the sub-basement, I guess. If we have the basement with history, then the prehistory we can think of as a kind of sub-basement in which everything, again, in singing and chanting and so on, you always have this rhythmical 1-2, 1-2, which I talk about Into the Lighthouse, because that's what Virginia Woolf talks about in her prose writing. Very, very important key to understanding, to grasping the underlying bilateral symmetry of her novel, and then also of Heart of Darkness. Okay, I'm going to say that I'll start by pointing to the bilateral symmetry in Heart of Darkness as a whole, of what we could call also the chiastic design of Heart of Darkness, so that the episodes are organized. I hadn't done this I hadn't prepared this, but I suppose it's we could say A, B, C, D, and then B, C, D, C, B, A would be the lettering then, the lettered form of the chiasm. What I mean by that is that the novel begins with a prologue. They're on the River Thames, and it, just for a moment, I'll say a few more things about that in a moment. So it has a prologue, but then it also has an epilogue matching the prologue. And in the epilogue, they're back on the Thames. So the epilogue refers back to the prologue, the very nice bilateral symmetry. By the way, remember that a bilateral symmetry, left-right symmetry, doesn't mean an identity. The prologue is like about that long. It goes on for several pages, very lengthy description, excuse me, of Marlowe sitting there like a Buddha, ready to tell one of his inconclusive tales. And it is kind of inconclusive. The writing is inconclusive because it returns, the conclusion returns, the end returns to the beginning. The epilogue, interesting, it's only about that long, and you don't need it. The narrator, or the captain, says, "Oh, we missed the tide." I think there's another reference. I don't have the book with me. There's another reference to Marlowe as being like a Buddha, something along those lines. And you think to yourself, well, who we don't need the prologue. That the novel ends, the climax of the novel, the climactic moment at the end, is really when Marlowe meets Kurtz's intended, and he says his final words were, "Your name." Outright lie, of course. What Kurtz said was, "The horror, the horror." Remember, he didn't say it just once, he said it twice. Nicely balanced final words of Kurtz. But the novel could very easily end, as I say in the talk about The Great Gatsby, Gatsby could end, the novel could end with Gatsby's death. Why not? Well, as I say, as I explain in the video on The Great Gatsby, it's because there's a prologue at the very beginning. It has to be balanced, balancing all. That title, by the way, maybe I could mention this right now. The title of the book that I'm working on, Balancing All, some of you may recognize, it comes from William Butler Yeats's poem, An Irish Airman Foresees His Death, which he says, I balanced all, brought all to mind. And then he says some other things that are very balanced as well. It's not coming immediately to mind, and so I won't mention it any further. But remember then, so what did I say? A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A. If we go to the second of those B's, it's his meeting with the intended, where he tells her about meeting Kurtz in Africa, and he tells her the big lie about Kurtz's final words. And if you go back and you ask yourself, well, where is there a B? Where is there a corresponding scene in the first part of the novel before he goes to Africa? He goes to visit his aunt. And you say to yourself, well, you know, especially if this were a play and if you had to cut a scene out because you had to compress the playing time of the play, you say, well, you know, we can get rid of that scene with the aunt. It's not really necessary. And you're right. It's not necessary at all to the development of the plot of Heart of Darkness. But it is necessary. It makes a very important contribution to the balance, so that you have these two scenes. In both cases, he meets a woman. It's a very personal relationship. At the same time, to be sure, there's a great imbalance in the significance of the scenes. The scene with the intended, you can't say, why don't we get rid of that very, really trivial scene? No, not at all. It's very, very essential to the effect of Heart of Darkness, the novella, let's say, unlike the meeting with the aunt. Okay, where are we? So the second C at the end of the novel, in this chiastic pattern, is the scene in which whatever the office is called that he goes to, and he gives them Kurtz's report, but he tears off the postscriptum that Kurtz appended to it, in which I'm just going on and on about the glories of the civilization that they worship us as though we were divine or gods, whatever it is. And then at the very end, he writes, "Exterminate the brutes." And it's interesting. Just notice the balance. I hadn't thought of it until right now, but you notice the balance between the spoken words, the final spoken words, the horror, which Marlowe suppresses by not repeating them, and then the other final words in Kurtz's report, "Exterminate the brutes," which he rips out and suppresses in that way as well. A very, very nice balancing, on a very small detail, very nice balancing of a suppression. Okay, where are we? The company office. I guess, right, so we're right in the middle then. And in the middle, what I have as my A, B, C, D, 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 the double D, as it were, is the first of them is the Grove of Death, where he sees all the Africans who are slowly dying. A very, very moving scene. And then the other D, the matching D, as it were, is aboard the ship, the boat where Kurtz is dying, and finally does die in the aboard the ship. So you have that balancing between a group of people dying in the Grove of Death, and then matching it right at the center of the novel, matching it, Kurtz's death aboard the ship. I want to, I'll try to keep this just a few more minutes. And again, to say, the essay is there, it's online. If you find it interesting, and there are other thoughts that are going through my mind that I won't share with you now because I would like to make it rather quick, is to point out that if you look at Heart of Darkness as you're reading it, and reading it with your eye not simply on the plot, not on what's there on the surface, the movement from beginning through back in the sepulchral city to Africa, to his arrival in Africa, and then finally his leaving, his returning he returns to the sepulchral city, but then in a doubling way. I suppose you have the sepulchral city, but then you also have London, so there's a pairing there as well. If you read and keep your eye on the portrayal of servitude in Heart of Darkness, and what you'll see, what I notice, and what I'll share with you, and you can think about it if you want, and you think that's really interesting, or maybe not at all, is the relationship between voluntary and involuntary, or maybe I'll reverse it, involuntary servitude and voluntary servitude. So with involuntary servitude, that certainly is the climactic central scene there is at the central station where he sees all of the Africans with chains around their necks, chains, they're chained together, and quite clearly the servitude that they experience is obviously it's not something that they chose for themselves. But remember, in the later on in the novel, then up at the interstation where he meets Kurtz, and at night he finds that the Africans Kurtz is involved in a ceremony with the Africans, a ceremony in which they're participating very voluntarily, presumably, and also from Kurtz's report, you understand that he's become a kind of leader, quite obviously, a leader. He's not a tyrant. He's not Simon Legree or whatever. He's someone whom they follow voluntarily. And what I find quite fascinating is to notice that example of the bilateral symmetry, the left-right relation between involuntary servitude and voluntary servitude, to notice how it plays out on a smaller level in the relationship between Marlowe and the young Russian, where in both cases there, it's a little bit different, both cases there, you have two men who are voluntary acolytes, if you will, voluntarily follow Kurtz, the young Russian, Kurtz, he enlarged my mind, and so on. And Marlowe, who defends, who protects Kurtz's reputation. And there, once again, what you notice is it's very important that Marlowe be a defender of Kurtz, become a kind of follower, become submissive in a way to Kurtz. Now, with the young Russian, you don't need him. You don't. If you're trying to cut the novel down or the staging of it, you want to get rid of a character, get rid of the Russian. You don't need him, but you do. Once again, very minor, but still, and Marlowe is major, not minor at all. That they again contribute to a symmetry. Notice too, with the accountant, you don't really need him. You need the Grove of Death when Marlowe observes all of these. I mean, it's horror. It's just the cruelty of the misery that's being inflicted on these natives. Do you really need the accountant? No. What you do need him, again, for the balance, because if Marlowe is going to meet Kurtz at the interstation, then he has to meet someone else in the central station. And so there, as though, again, it's the symmetrical imperative. It's as though that Conrad is writing under the influence of the symmetrical imperative. And this bilateral imperative, I'll call it again. And this bilateral imperative, we could say, emerges, or we witness the emergence of the bilateral imperative, the workings of the bilateral imperative as we read the novel. There are other examples. If you're curious and if you'd like to do some of this yourself, it's very, very easy. If you have a Kindle, and who doesn't, I guess, I just, with my Kindle app, just go do a word search. There are two words. I'll end with this. There are two words. The word collar, C-O-L-L-A-R. Do a word search on the word collar, and also do a word search on wool, W-O-O-L. Oh, but I have to point out, Conrad uses a synonym for wool. It's the word worsted, W-O-R-S-T-E-D, which doesn't mean that it's worse, that it's really awful. It's a synonym for wool, and notice that in one case the wool is black, and another in its second in its recurrence, when it returns, it's white wool, white worsted. Okay, well, listen, I'm going to stop with that, and again, mention to you at least, and decide yourself if you'd like to look up the article. What did I say? It's called Always Symmetrize, Forging Bonds in Heart of Darkness, and it will return in the book that I'm working on, Balancing All, the Bilateral Imperative of Writing. Okay, thank you.